So this really is an honour for me to be here. It's my first time at the Enabling Group and to be with you in your process of discernment. And it's a gift, isn't it, to be able to do this together in person in this wonderful diversity of God's people. So I'm grateful to Simeon and Paul yesterday for their presentation. This morning, we're going to explore the causes of poverty too, but through a very different lens. I won't be using graphs, I won't be using data, and I warn you, I will be challenging. Just to say a little about my background, I grew up in an Anglican clergy household, but I became estranged from the church before a conversion experience in my mid-20s, after which I was received into the Catholic tradition. I'm the founder-director of Together for the Common Good, the first idea of which came to me in 2011 when I experienced a movement of the Spirit in my life, and I was prompted to explore a groundbreaking ecumenical partnership between church leaders in Liverpool over a 20-year period between 1975 and 95, in which my father was a leading figure. That partnership played an important part in the renewal of the city at a time of division and political confusion, and it also stimulated a new spirit of ecumenism. Their partnership had two defining features. One, the posture of the outward-facing church, engaging with the life of the neighbourhood, and two, the theological tradition of Catholic social thought, which is centred around the dignity of the human person and solidarity with the poor. So Together for the Common Good was inspired by their model. We're a small national charity dedicated to spiritual and civic renewal. But this is a new time, and it has different challenges, and so a new approach is needed. We work ecumenically, and we're independent of any denomination. And we read the signs of the times to help people across the churches build common good by becoming outward-facing and relational, to understand their distinctively Christian civic vocation. And we call this common good thinking. So we work across the country with churches, leaders, schools, and other organisations. And just to say what I mean by the common good, it's not a utopian ideal, but it's something we build. It's the shared life of a society as we work together across our differences for mutual flourishing, each of us taking responsibility according to our calling and ability. So that's as much as I can say about my work just now. The focus today is for you, and it's on poverty. But please get in touch with me later if you'd like to know more about what we do. So just to say, I'm going to talk for about half an hour with moments of silence to pause along the way, and then we'll have time for discussion and discernment together. So let's stop for a moment of quiet, and I just want to share with you this reading from Corinthians. And just to say, come Holy Spirit, we welcome you here in our midst. Bless us with your spirit of wisdom and discernment. Okay, so let's look a little deeper at the causes of poverty. Now, remember, there's no such thing as a neutral view. So what theological worldview am I taking? I listen and learn across the Christian traditions, and I learn from the leading political thinkers of our time. In particular, I draw on the Catholic social thought tradition, which sometimes is called the theology of the Holy Spirit in practice. You may or may not be familiar with it. Profoundly rooted in the gospel, it's intended for all people of goodwill, not just for Catholics, and it consists of a series of long-form letters drawing on social and political expertise, data, lived experience across the world. This body of thinking has accumulated over many centuries, but in particular, since 130 years ago when it mounted a theological response to the Industrial Revolution. So it's concerned with the whole of God's creation, and in particular the human person. It's realistic and it's not utopian. Its stated purpose is to build a civilization of love. It covers everything from marriage to evangelization to peace to justice. So why do I want to deepen our understanding of poverty in this way? Because if we don't understand the root causes, we can get stuck on meeting immediate needs, and we need to see further than government policy. We need a bigger frame. We may think evangelization is the only solution, or we can inadvertently prop up an unjust system. There's a very real risk if the church is becoming what Lenin called the useful idiots, if we make the wrong call. And we need to understand this because we're in a new time. Many of the assumptions we carry, political, social, may be out of date. So the process of exploring the causes through this lens, I hope, will help with our discernment about how God is calling us to join him in his vision for the renewal of our country. 7 years ago, Pope Francis said, we're entering an era of change, not an era of change, but a change of era. He was one of several who noticed after the crash of 2008 that the old era was beginning to break down. So these are years of profound change, and we can call this an interregnum. A new era is yet to be born, and so in the meantime, there's a political term for this, interregnum. In the meantime, we can expect to see all manner of morbid symptoms. This is a time of intense political confusion. There are many competing ideologies. So it's vital to ensure that we're looking at this through a Christian worldview, not a secular worldview. Now, it is true that the cost of living crisis is not a post-pandemic phenomenon, but its causes didn't start 10 years ago. It goes back much further. We need to zoom right out and see the bigger picture, or we won't understand what's going on. Every era is characterized by a particular philosophy. And that philosophy shapes what we call the political economy. That is the arrangements that determine wages, the state of our housing, the way that capital behaves, the types of jobs generated. Political economy is always shaped by ideas. So the animating idea of the current era is breaking down. It comes from the philosophy of liberalism. Now, this manifests in various forms, and some of it has been positive. But in the last 45 years or so, it's morphed into an ideology known as neoliberalism. Further back, its roots are in the Enlightenment, but it manifested in 1979 in the form of neoclassical economics, which prioritized shareholder interest and the pursuit of profit maximization over everything else. And this involved removing the constraints from finance capital. And this ushered in 4 decades of transactional individualism and the system of globalization across the West. We can describe this era as the era of contract. So this type of economic model that this philosophy generates is inherently unstable because it's founded on a false anthropology, a desiccated, soulless conception of the human being, a false idea of freedom, quite different from a Christian anthropology where human beings are seen as transcendent, relational beings made in the image of God. And Pope Benedict writes about this brilliantly in his document Caritas in Veritate in 2009 as part of his response to the financial crisis of 2008. So we learn from this that finance capital has a tendency to dehumanize and to commodify human beings and the natural world. It does generate wealth, of course, and that's good, but it has a tendency to exploit, and it requires units of labor, that's us, human beings, to be cheap and mobile. So this insistence on having to move to find work used to be seen as right-wing, but now it's rebranded as freedom. This transactional freedom brought prosperity for some, but it broke parts of our country. Investment moved out of certain areas, and this caused civic and spiritual degradation. It drew the brightest and the best away from their places of belonging to the big cities. This was, in fact, a politics of abandonment. It was a breach of the common good. And governments of all parties over the last 4 decades have perpetuated this system. None have had the political vision to challenge the hegemonic power of finance capital. Even the Labour Party abandoned its Methodist and Catholic roots and embraced this liberal ideology, becoming estranged from its heartlands, losing 3 elections. So after 3 decades of no sign of reform of this economic system, the so-called left behind had had enough of this liberal domination and mismanagement because they lived the consequences. They literally had nothing to lose. So their reaction was framed by big money interests as populist, but in previous eras, it would have been understood as a peasants' revolt. Every country that has followed this system is seeing the same effects. The motivation of this spirit is anti-human, and that's why the system is now unraveling. And as the old era is dying, we see multiple morbid symptoms. So this cost of living crisis is just one. It's inevitable in this kind of political economy. So there's a vicious cycle at work here that connects the economic and the social, which I think addresses your question, John. So we get the dominance of banking profit that promotes an intensified consumerism and low wages, which in turn generates social pathologies, which in turn leads to more welfare expenditure, which in turn requires more state redistribution, which then leads to more consumerism, which leads to more pathologies and so on. So as this is playing out, we're seeing a collaboration between the powers of finance capital and the technocratic state, which when they become too powerful and when they are unconstrained, are effectively what we might conceive of as the principalities and powers. Catholic social thought always looks for a balance of power where the human being is not dominated. So these powers of money and state should be constrained, for example, through the tax system, through strong countervailing civil society institutions like unions, churches, associations, local business, and through the deconcentrating of capital. So, for example, shifting from the big 6 international banks to regional banking. And countervailing forces also through distributed power, so renewing democratic processes at regional and local levels. But currently, these forces can operate with relative impunity. Who made the most money during COVID? Jeff Bezos and Amazon, the large banks, and now, of course, the energy companies are profiteering from the energy crisis. So this philosophy generates economic and social consequences. Liberalism incorporates the idea of the unencumbered self, which produces the culture of self, emphasizing rights over responsibilities. This is effectively an assault on relationship. It generates conditions that lead to the pathologies such as family breakdown, atomization, the fragmentation of communities, political polarization, increased loneliness, which statistically is higher among the young than the old, breakdowns in social trust, exploitation of the person and natural world, extreme inequality, civic degradation, psychological distress, and spiritual confusion. In its extreme form, this philosophy conceptualizes family as a constraint, and tradition, accountability, and mutual obligation are seen as obstacles to progress. Even relationship to place is seen as old-fashioned. So for shorthand, we can call this way of seeing the world individualism, where the primacy of God is subordinated to the primacy of self. It generates poverty in all its forms, economic, relational, spiritual, leading to the breakdown of morality. it also generates the cult of identitarian politics, which, with its culture of self in the form of victimhood, generates a battle of rights, which has led to the culture wars. So in simple terms, this individualistic philosophy is hostile to human beings, who are social beings. It generates poverty in these two significant ways: economic terms, generating low wages, requiring a bigger and bigger welfare state, which ends up subsidizing business, which pays wages too low to live on. And in social terms, it generates pathologies which the state ends up having to solve. So whose side is the church on? As we begin to discern our responses to poverty, what can we learn from Jesus in his time? It is clear whose side Jesus was on. Now, the biblical scholars among you may spot some parallels here with the Roman political economy in Galilee. Jesus was a manual worker, part of the peasantry. The Roman economy privileged the elites who controlled the storehouses and kept down the wages of the poor. Jesus resisted the excesses of this economy and the damage it wrought by promoting the kingdom, which took spiritual as well as civic form. His instinct was to bring people together in solidarity across class, across race, across educational background, to build a relational power. Jesus offered non-violent, sacrificial resistance, emphasizing love and just relationships. From the Gospels, Catholic social thought derives a set of principles, including solidarity and the preferential option for the poor, and it's centered on upholding the integrity and dignity of the human being. So just as our Lord was then, we are called to be the embodiment of love in a desecrated world, to build common good with God and with each other in the places where we live, to accompany each other in solidarity, to offer some resistance to the dominance of these principalities and powers, to offer a sacred space for contemplation, to recognize the transcendent, a place to be loved and heard, to share and build bonds, a sense of family. In this sense, we could say that building common good is an insurgency against individualism. The coming months and years are likely to be hard. The political class is currently showing little sign of the guts or the vision required to undertake economic reform. And the underlying trends, as Paul and Simeon showed us yesterday, show that the low-wage phenomenon is advancing. It's creeping into the formerly affluent classes. So the signs of globalization breaking down may mean that local food and energy production will become more important. We will need to build up a greater sense of mutual dependence at local level. So how will the churches respond? Will they act in solidarity with poor communities? This could be an inflection point for the churches, for those willing to make the cultural shift to become more relational at local level. Now, some churches may be able to make this shift, and some already have. But many, especially the institutional denominations, have become captured by a middle-class culture and have lost connection with poor communities. Pope Francis says the church needs to be in relationship with poor people. He says that when someone is poor, he or she has a sense of the need for others and for God, an instinct of interdependence that the affluent so easily lose. God is at work in poor communities. He honors the poor especially. So Francis goes further. He says the church needs to be evangelized by the poor, recognizing that much of the church has become estranged from poor communities, and in this way, the whole body becomes impoverished. So we do need to ask, why has this happened? And whose side is the church on? Can we consider some factors around this estrangement? First, Language so often used about poor people in church social action circles indicates this estrangement. One very good test is to ask if what is said internally can be said in front of poor people. I think language must be consistent to terms like marginalised, outreach, service delivery, engagement. This is not the language of friendship and mutual respect. From a church-centric position, it may appear so, but from God's worldview, poor people are not marginal. It depends where you stand and who you know. The numbers of people classified as poor is at least 14 million people. That's at least 20% of the population. And 750,000 households are currently at risk of mortgage default. That's a lot of people. It doesn't feel marginal to me. This managerial language is part of an approach that's well-intentioned, but which unintentionally others the people it aims to help. Community development, projects, facilitators, and other professionalised roles, all of this is part of the culture of contract. This great effort to fix things is quite different from the covenantal approach of prayerful listening to God and dwelling in the local with neighbours. Second, the food bank paradox. Now, this is well known in the sector, as they say. They meet increasing need, but also mask the real problem. They are now a key component in a low-wage economy, propping up big business. The more efficient emergency food aid becomes, the less urgent economic reform appears. Food banks are often sources of pride in churches, well-meaning people who want to justify their usefulness to the state. But the church has a sacred vocation to be transformational, not useful. Churches may be delighted to be providing services for local authorities, but the service-client dynamic can inadvertently alienate the very people it aims to help. It needs to be reciprocal, relational. It may be a little harsh, but it was once said, the poor are not the raw material of your salvation. Pope Francis says that Christians must stop outsourcing charity to service providers and instead live a shared life. He says we must commit to a mutual sharing of life that does not allow proxies. So this requires congregational culture change to become communities of place. Third factor I'd like to share with you is about advocacy. The church talks a lot about advocacy for the poor, as if the poor needs the church to be angry because they can't do it for themselves. Well, in recent democratic events, poor people did use their voice and their vote, but were held in contempt for doing so. So it's not surprising that they gave up on the church when it failed to defend their interests, as it had done in the past, and when it failed to advocate for fundamental economic reform over many years, decades. As my friend David Gannon texted me last month, quote, "The church has alienated working class people by turning into a woke food bank. It needs to start acting like a church again. The cost of living nerds are barking up the wrong tree. State handouts are soul-destroying. People need dignified work so that they can maintain some self-respect as well as a life." He added, "Unfettered capital has screwed the country. Our economy needs to be pinned to the towns and cities it serves." Unquote. Fourth factor here, there is sometimes a naivety in the churches about the economy and what we might call welfarism. Now, my father, in his book, Bias to the Poor, published 40 years ago this year, which was very influential on the church at that time, made the mistaken assumption that financial redistribution through the tax system was the solution to poverty. Well, it didn't work. As we saw earlier, things have got much worse. Campaigning for increases in benefits is helpful in the short term and essential, I grant you that. and it assuages some guilt in the affluent, but it does nothing to address the underlying dysfunction. It also contributes to a politics of low expectations. So rather than just focusing on benefits, the churches should take a covenantal approach. Place-based investment and decent jobs are needed to restore the abandoned places. This is what we should be calling for. Within Catholic social teaching, dignity of work is central. We're not comfortable with parking people on benefits for 5 generations. As the recent report from Church Action on Poverty showed, there have been more church closures in low-income areas than in affluent areas, signalling to poor communities that the church doesn't care. So when the church seems to, or actually does, collude with money power and state power, and abandons the places in which it has served for centuries, this is a breach of common good. Compare this with Jesus, who never abandons the poor. The poor he honors the most. He says, I will be with you always. His love is covenantal, not contractual. So when we think about poverty, we should ask ourselves, whose side is the church on? Might it involve attending to spiritual poverty as well as material poverty? Consciously shifting from a culture of contract to a culture of covenant. Supporting families, recognizing the brokenness that the culture of individualism has done. Building common good in our neighborhoods. Attending to the relational poverty generated by the culture of individualism. Calling for economic reform, shifting our emphasis from welfarism to the dignity of work, especially with the coming onslaught of AI. Are we going to settle for that? We might be out of step with everybody else, but what's our Christian response? Could we be calling for investment in the abandoned places, public and private? Should we be lamenting the 0 hours contract and the low wage culture that undermines the family? Could we be convening coalitions of business leaders and employers to come together for the good of their city or region? Could we be directing church land, assets and buildings to community benefit? Could we become a people who dwell with God and neighbour? Communities of place, relational, outward-facing, welcoming local families who are struggling, being congregations that are comfortable to welcome an ex-offender and his family, offering a hand up and a sense of belonging. Could we be building up the leadership of ordinary people, cultivating leaders on housing estates? Could we be upholding what we know to be sacred, that human beings and the natural world are not commodities, but a sacred inheritance to treasure and nurture? Could we be asserting confidently a distinctive Christian identity, resisting the temptation to be useful? Could we be resisting empire by building coalitions across class, across race, across interests, across opinion, across educational background? As Jesus did, can we now reweave solidarity to uphold the human space against the principalities and powers? So as you are considering your response in your table groups, I'd suggest that this time calls for a kind of tragic realism. Of course we meet emergency needs, but we must also point to the kingdom. It's pragmatic and prophetic, both and. We need to hold this tension. So I'm going to give you this reading from Isaiah. Would somebody like to read it out for me? Who would just like to read it out?
your
Great
Asian
ruins shall be rebuilt. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations. You shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to live in.
Okay, so I'll just encourage you to gather on your tables and share what's on your heart in response to what I've said. I recognise not everyone will agree with me. It may have been challenging, but that's the whole point, isn't it? To provoke your discernment